Hi there, BookTube. Well, it's the middle of May, so it's definitely time, or beyond time, that I did a wrap-up of the things I've read in April and tell you what were my dislikes and discoveries and any kind of relative disappointments. And I finished 13 books in April. It was quite a varied month of reading. Not such a ridiculous number of readathon-y, reading eventy things as March, thank heavens. I think I took part in Sagalong and the Disability Readathon and Aussie April, but yeah. And out of those 13 things that I finished this month, I had 6 5-star reads, which is almost an excessive number. But I have to say that some of those things were 5 stars for very, very different reasons. And to give you an example, one of those was Egil's saga, an Icelandic saga that I read for Sagalong, Sagalong 2022. And, something like Egil's saga is not... It's not a 5-star book in a kind of the conventional sense of why I'd give something 5 stars. It was 5 stars for me because I think of all the sagas that I've read, and I've read quite a few more over the last few years because of Sagalong, which has been brilliant. This could be the most enjoyable in many ways, or the most readable, with characters that you kind of get for extended periods and can see through their life and attach to. Yeah. Now the Sagalong hosted a brilliant job of talking about Egil Saga, and Tilly was one of the sort of Sagalong champions, and I made 3 videos with her that are on her channel, Tilly Shelf, so I will link to those and say nothing more about it. Complete sort of contrast in terms of another 5-star book of the month would be the Slowworm song by Andrew Miller, which is absolute bang up to date contemporary fiction, and so you're just not comparing like with like, are you? Why was that a 5-star read? And it's one of those books where I wonder if by the end of the year, sometimes by the time I get to December or January, some of the things I read in the year have sort of risen in my estimation because of how I remember them, and others will have dropped. I don't know, but so I always feel that a 5-star rating for a new piece of fiction is perhaps more provisional. However, the Slowworm song is it's a first-person narrative by a former soldier and recovering alcoholic, and it's a novel about guilt and regret, I think, and about being human and being fallible and dealing with that or not dealing with that. I think that description makes it sound a bit sort of, I don't know, emotionally slushy, and it's not. If it was, it wouldn't have appealed to me. It's quite tightly written. Miller writes very intelligent prose. I've enjoyed a few of his books, I have to say. His last one was historical fiction. Last couple that I read were historical fiction. I particularly like Pure, his one about a Parisian cemetery. Yeah, have a look it up. But this one is quite realistic, I suppose, and to an extent hopeful. But it's one of several books that I've read in April, coincidentally, that are kind of exploring, I don't know, how ordinary people can end up doing dreadful things, committing atrocities or betraying their those around them, or it's an interesting theme and I guess a perennial one because of how human beings are. Another example of that would be the book I read that was from an author from a country where I've never read an author from that country before, and that was The Silent Steppe by Mukhamet, Shayakhmetov, and I've done a scallydandling video about that. He's from Kazakhstan, but so I won't really say much more about it, but he's writing a memoir of surviving a period of Kazakh history, that the early 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s, when around a quarter of the Kazakh population was wiped out, and neighbours and relatives betrayed each other to survive kind of disastrous period of Soviet rule for Kazakhstan. It's a recommended read, but as I say, it's got its own video. That theme of what people will do, when they're living under a particular sort of regime, was very strong in the other non-fiction book that I read this month, which is also a memoir, and that's Before Night Falls by Reinaldo Arenas. And this book I read for Jen and Greg's LGBTQ books in translation kind of book group. I'll give a link to Jen's channel so you can find out more about that if you're interested, because this is a rolling thing. But Arenas is a Cuban writer. When the book was translated by Dolores Koch, and from the original Spanish, he was born under the Batista regime in Cuba. Dirt poor, real struggling childhood, and then the Cuban Revolution came, and he was involved in that, and he became, he then got the opportunity to sort of study higher education sort of under the Cuban communist regime, but then he becomes a critic and a dissenter under the regime, and that was kind of intertwined with his identity as a gay man, because Cuba under Castro was acutely intolerant of gay people, and was really homophobic, and it was something that would lead to you being persecuted and imprisoned. And for him, the combination of being gay and sort of a dissenter against the regime was sort of just it was part and parcel of each other, but both put him at risk of persecution, and he was indeed imprisoned. Now, and then one of the interesting aspects of the memoir was his observation of how people who were his friends or his colleagues, or and particularly fellow writers, kind of compromised their principles and their humanity, indeed, in electing to save themselves and kind of go along with the Castro's regime sort of ideology and attitude, including attitude to gay sexuality, but not just that, and we followed him through his development. I guess his development as a writer, a period of a bit of success, but then prison and attempts to escape. And ultimately he does get to leave Cuba and go to the States. And then another particularly interesting bit of the book, I think, for me in a way, was how he realizes that exile is no paradise. That as an exile you're quite lonely and conflicted, because you still feel your loyalty is still, I guess, in a way, to where you come from, and you're expected to be grateful and appreciative of where you are, but you also see the flaws in that society. And he also ends up with AIDS, and ultimately that leads to his death. So very complex story with a lot of politics, a lot of sort of history, a lot of his personal ideas and emotions and thoughts. One element of the book is that we get one wow, an almost interminable sort of listing of his sexual encounters. And that was one of the reasons why I was glad to be reading it in a group, with a group kind of conversation on Discord, to explore that. And why, I mean, I suppose what I would say is, if I were reading a book by a straight male writer who wrote so much about his sort of sexual relationships, sexual encounters, with women, I would find that quite a turn off. It's something quite almost like macho about the way he talks about this. But, and you can't get away from the fact that it's an absolute central part of the book, and I suppose an understanding that was, it's not just about sex, it's also about that sort of dissent and otherness, and not being able to just be comfortable in his own identity in Cuba under Castro. So layers of context and psychology in this book. So not my favourite book of the month, but interesting. Now, two of the novels that I read this month also kind of go into that theme, I suppose, of what we as people might do if put in a certain set of circumstances that really challenges our morals and our decency. And these two are both, I suppose you could loosely speaking describe them as dystopian near future novels. One's called Wivenhoe by Samuel Fisher, came out in February this year. It's set in a village in Essex, a village that I know well, actually. And the physical descriptions that added an extra element, because I could picture, where the pub they were describing, he was describing, and so on. But the premise of the book is that there's been a kind of an environmental disaster, and that's basically dramatic climate change, Arctic conditions in what was Essex, and the impact that has on people, and the sort of breakdown of social systems and behaviour. And yeah, it was a good book. Not a 5-star read, but very atmospheric, quite short, quite pacey, quite dramatic. Yeah, I liked it. Like nice solid 4-star. Now, the other one of these two dystopian novels was The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott, and I read that for Aussie April because it came out in 2020, and I've heard so many rave reviews of this book. I really wanted to read it. So although it was another sort of solid 4-star read, it was oddly one of the month's disappointments for me, in that I was expecting it to be like right up there as one of my top things of the month. It's like Wivenhoe, it has strong environmental themes, and again it's looking at what people will do to survive when the world has changed, when there's kind of political and environmental sort of breakdown, I suppose. It starts with a really lovely fable, and in a way I would have liked more of that in the book, and that is the story of The Rain Heron. Then the first half of the book, you've got three individual stories, and ultimately they kind of come together. It takes you a while to realise that the child you read about in one part of the first half is an adult character involved later in the book. The second half of the book is almost a bit more of a kind of like a road trip tale. It wasn't as successful for me, the second half, and although, as I say, I'm being more negative about this book than I should be, because I was expecting it to be even better, but it came to a slightly unsatisfying conclusion for me. It didn't quite live up to its initial promise. That's how I put it. So let's swap to talking about the best things of this month. And I've got 4 kind of best bits, I suppose. One was a play, and it was played by Kaite O'Reilly that I read for the Disability Readathon. It's called Peeling, came out in 2002. Tilly and I made a discussing drama video about it, so I'm not going to describe it here, but if you were interested in themes around disability, kind of innovative modern drama, you know, by a disabled woman writer, have a look at the video, which I'll link to below, and it's a strong recommendation, you know, a 5-star play for me. But let's go on to 3 very different 5-star novels. Now, one is They Burn Thistles, or They Burn the Thistles, depending on the translation you read, by Yaşar Kemal, translated by Margaret Platon, and that was a 1969 novel from Turkey. It's the second part of a trilogy, no, quartet possibly, I think, but I'm not sure they're all available in English, and it's the sequel to Mehmed My Hawk, which I read in January, and if you follow this channel you will know that I raved about that book in January. And I read it with Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventures. She read it in Turkish, I read it in English, and we vowed to do the same with the next book in the sequence. So that's why we read They Burn Thistles in April. It absolutely lived up to my expectations. In fact, if anything, I liked it even more than Mehmed My Hawk. I mean, there's no point, I guess, in saying loads and loads about book 2 of a series. You know, like if you're going to read anything, if you haven't yet read Mehmed My Hawk, you're not going to read this one. And if you have read Mehmed My Hawk, I bet you've gone on to this one too, because you also will have loved Mehmed My Hawk. Yeah. But what I would say is it's a book that brings together kind of very lyrical writing, tremendous description of landscape, and brilliant characters, a kind of a political, social understanding, but a really kind of vigorous plot. Yeah, so, you know, that adds up to 5 stars, doesn't it? Without a doubt. Now, funnily enough, I read another 1969 novel in translation, also a 5-star read for me, and by another author who has yet to fable me, I suppose, in anything I've read by them, and that's Clarice Lispector. And I read her novel An Apprenticeship, or The Book of Pleasures, and you know, that's the whole title, The Apprenticeship or A Book of Pleasures, The Book of Pleasures. And Lispector's Brazilian. I tend to go a bit overboard about her and her books on this channel. They're gradually coming out in good modern English translations. This one was translated by Stefan Tobler and came out in 2021, and I read it with Una of Codex Cantina, Alan of Big Up Books and Classics, and Fraser of Fraser Simon's Springboard Thought. Una has done a video about it, I know, that will come out in Women in Translation Month. Fraser talked about it in one of his weekly wrap-ups, but in some detail, and Alan of Big Up Books and Classics has done a great little video about it. So rather than me go on yet again about a Lispector novel, I think I'll link to Alan's, and you'll get a flavour, if you're curious, about why An Apprenticeship is just a top-rate novel. Yeah. Now, the third one that's in my sort of top 3 novels of the month is often described as the first modern European novel, and it probably gave me the greatest satisfaction of anything that I read this month, and that's because it's Don Quixote by Cervantes, and it's one of those books. I don't know, do you have this? I have this. I have like a list in my head of things that I really ought to have read, you know, not in a worthy way, but just a feeling of like, I can't believe I haven't read this or that. And I'm really trying to work through these, you know, before I run out of time. And Don Quixote was, you know, really high on that list. And some things on that list, when you come to read them, you can see you can see why. I think most things on that list, you can see why they're still read now. You know, why people consider them classics and, you know, keep coming back to them after, you know, hundreds of years or 100 years or whatever in each case. Some of them are a bit of a challenge to read, something like, Milton's Paradise Lost comes to mind, really rewarding, but not easy. Don Quixote is just a dream. I mean, it's long, but it's just a joy to read as far as I was concerned. Helped by the fact that I read it with a brilliant group of people on Voxer, and we read it over March and April. The book comes in two halves. The first volume was published in 1605 and the second volume in 1615, so it sort of fell naturally to read one volume in each month. Most people in the Voxer group loved it. Not everyone's finished it yet, and that's fine, because, it's the sort of book that you can read fast or slow, I guess. Some didn't love it. Fraser Simons was part of the group, and I don't think he loved it. Some people found the earthy humour perhaps a bit off-putting. And although it's described as the first modern novel, it's a bit, baggier and more episodic perhaps than most 21st century novels would be. But it is funny and vigorous and creative. I think I enjoyed volume 2 more than volume 1 in a way. I mean, volume 1 has some of the famous scenes like, tilting at windmills and all that. But volume 2 is just perhaps a little bit, a little bit more of a through plot. And it always becomes more of a tragedy in volume 2, because you get a greater and greater sense of Quixote's, kind of nobility of character, and the way his idealism is thwarted by the world he lives in, by reality, but also, other people just not being as noble and idealistic as he is. If you've ever thought, oh, perhaps I should read Don Quixote one day, I'd say please do. Go for it. Don't be put off. So what's left? What's left for my month? A graphic novel. Now, that was, I think, my only real 3-star read of the month, and that may have been a bit unfair. It was Bad Island by Stanley Donwood. It's a book of kind of full-page woodcuts and no words, and it is absolutely beautiful to look at, but it didn't have enough plot for me, for graphic fiction, as a piece of graphic fiction. I think it would be better described almost as a sort of a long graphic poem without any words. Does that make any sense? If you, I hope it does. If you've read it, tell me if that makes sense to you as well. So I didn't dislike it, but it didn't quite, hit the spot for me, much as I visually enjoyed it. I read 2 actual poetry collections this month, and I shall round up with those. One of them, The Heeding, also had really beautiful woodcut or possibly lino cut illustrations, and I would actually say, so it was The Heeding, it was by Rob Cowen, the poems, and the illustrations were by Nick Hayes, and it came out this year, in 2022. It's brand new. I think it was a book of 3-star poetry and 5-star illustration, so I wound up giving it 4 stars overall. That's which is funny, isn't it? But the poems are were all written during the COVID lockdown, and there's some lovely nature poetry in there. I think why was perhaps the poetry 3-star and the illustrations 4-star? I think almost that these poems may have come too soon after COVID, and I'm not sure if that's too soon for the writer. He should have given himself perhaps more time to reflect before pulling them together and putting them out as a collection, or whether it was too soon for me as a reader, and that if I go back to this book in 5 years' time, I may feel differently about it. But yeah, I mean, if you've read it, I would love to hear. And I don't want to put you off it, because there's some good things in it. Then the final thing I'm going to talk about this month was my other book of poetry and the other thing I read for the Disability Readathon, and that's Ultimatum Orangutan by Khairani Barokka. That came out in 2021. Barokka is Indonesian, but she writes mostly in English, although she does throw in some Indonesian words, which is something that I quite enjoy, I suppose. I've read other collections in English by writers of sort of, different heritage who kind of bring their other language into their poetry. It's quite powerful, quite exciting poetry, I would say. She's a disability activist. She's also really passionate about kind of environmental issues and colonialism, and I suppose how they intersect, about how sort of the environmental impact of colonialism disproportionately affects in the position of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, and in particular in her native Indonesia. I think that she I know that she kind of is a performance poet as well as writing her poetry and producing her poetry in written form, and I think that this would be even better live, and I have watched some sort of YouTube videos of her performing some of the poems from the book, and I think that would be even stronger in a way than the written collection. But it was still it was still a 4-star collection for me, but it might be 5 stars in performance, if you know what I mean. So that was my April. I hope your April was as varied and as interesting and had as such great delights and satisfactions as I had, and do tell me about it. And particularly if you've read any of the books that I read, I always love to hear other people's opinions, whether similar or different.